Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Victoria Dougherty. He is the author of The Bone Church, Welcome to the Hotel Yalta, and Cold. She writes fiction, drama, and essays that revolve around lovers, killers, curses, and destinies. Her work has been published or profiled in the New York Times, USA Today, the International Herald Tribune, and elsewhere. Earlier in her career, while living in Prague, she co-founded Black Box Theatre, translating, producing, and acting in several Czech plays. Her blog, Cold, features her short essays on faith, love, family, love, and writing. WordPress, the blogging platform that hosts some 70 million blogs worldwide, has singled out Cold as one of the top 50 recommended blogs by writers or about writing. So, Victoria, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. By the way, I've been watching your vlogs, and that's one of the main reasons why I invited you. And I guess that my audience will be a bit amazed by the fact that I invited an artist, because that's very unusual on
Not a
my channel.
philosopher.
Not a philosopher, not a scientist, but I mean, now you will get to know that I'm also interested in these types of subjects. So.
Exactly. Well, I come from a family of scientists and writers, way back when. So I think writers kind of are philosophers and scientists. We're interested in all sorts of these things and how they work and how they play. When it comes to our very natures.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's why I love watching your series, because I think that it actually enriches me as a writer. I think it helps me understand people, the way people really work, the way people really think, the way it's the sort of intellectual play that you and I were talking about, that's so important for developing a sort of rich idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's interesting, because I guess that when we're talking about other people particularly, and even many times about our own selves, I mean, there are things we understand. There's a lot of things that we don't understand even about ourselves. So basically, I guess that even as writers or scientists, particularly psychologists, I mean, we are all the time trying to uncovering things that are somewhat buried deep down in our psyches or in our minds. And I mean, it's very tricky. And I guess that even for you, sometimes to try and write about characters that are so different from you, and I guess that sometimes it's hard, right? Even to think about people that don't behave and don't think as we do, right?
I find it exciting. I love to write about people who aren't like me. I mean, even people who I would, in my personal life, have a really negative reaction to. I actually wrote one character a few years ago that I think I would actively despise. As a person, because he just exemplified everything I don't like in a person. He was this sort of Soviet apparatchik who just did everything he could try to do to get ahead within the system, and also really hurt people while he did that. I mean, really caused people to be killed, and I developed a real empathy for him. I didn't like him better. That doesn't mean I want to invite him into my life, but it was very exciting writing that character and writing his sort of inner workings. He ended up killing himself because he would have otherwise been murdered by another Soviet agent who he happened to get in his crosshairs, and he was a smarter operator. The other agent was just a smarter operator. But I I love that. I think that that is something that I think that's one of the things that makes me write, is that I'm interested in what people are doing and why they're doing those things, and how it is that they come to their worldview with that interesting combination of innate personality traits and experience that's so rich and fun and that has us glued to Game of Thrones, for instance, on the television, or engrossed in Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
Through 500 pages of Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I was trying to leave Game of Thrones for later in the interview, but maybe let's talk about it right away, because I mean, there's a very interesting side of it, particularly about the television series, because particularly in this last season, I mean, even before that, there were already some iffy things going around there, but particularly in this last season, I guess that it's interesting to talk about how people reacted to the fact that certain things happened in a rush and weren't really that well explained where they came from, and also the fact that certain characters didn't have fulfilling endings and didn't complete their arcs, in a sense, like for example Daenerys, Jaime. I mean, it was
John, Tyrion, all of them just sort of fell flat. Yeah, for me.
And that's interesting, because there are two elements to it. The first element is what people get right about it, because I mean, is it true that things should have been a different way? Is it true that the producers and the writers could have done a better job of it? But that's one thing. The other thing is what people get wrong about it, because this is basically about expectations, right? And since the expectations of not all fans, of course, but let's say a significant number of them didn't get fulfilled, then that's why people got really frustrated with it. But I mean, there are the two sides that we have to take into account, right?
Definitely. And plus, I mean, I have no idea what it must be like to make a television series. And I know that just, with plays, because I do have some experience with plays, there are so many elements that are sometimes competing with one another, that, even if you've got a great cast, if you've got a good director and you've got a good play, that certainly makes it more likely that it's going to be an enjoyable experience for the audience. But it's certainly not a sure thing, because it's a living, breathing entity, and I think that as writers, we perhaps have a little more control over it, because we decide when it's time to put this work out, right? And I don't know if there's the same kind of control with the television series, but one of the things that I did feel with Game of Thrones, and tell me if you felt this same. I've only just started reading the Game of Thrones series now that I've seen the show. I came very late to the show too, and I felt like with the last season and a little bit before that, like you said, that it started to feel more like fan fiction to me than something that was truly derived from Martin's work. And the closer the series stuck to Martin's work, the richer it felt for me, and certainly a lot of people don't feel that way, so, but I felt like particularly the last season was like that it lost that sense of richness, that sense of nuance. And part of that could have just been that the creators were ready to be done and to move on. Okay, let's finish this up, and maybe the attention to detail wasn't there, but maybe not. Maybe they tried just as hard on that series, but when something hasn't been written yet and you've been following it closely, and then you think, okay, I've got this, and you really don't have it, because you're dealing with somebody else's creation, and that's always precarious. I mean, I know from translating plays that, I'd never translated anything fictional before, and I translated a couple of plays, gosh, a long, long time ago, and it was the first time, and I was in my 20s then, it was the first time that I realized, oh wow, this is an art. This is something completely different than I thought it was. It is not just a matter of taking this person's words and putting them into this language. And I think it's made me terrified of ever having any of my books translated, because I know how wrong it can go, and how important it is not just to have someone who is fluent in 2 languages, but who is as good a writer or better writer than you are, and who understands your work. And I think that when you're adapting something, even, obviously it wasn't going from, English to Spanish with Game of Thrones. But I think that when you're adapting something for television, I think the same principles apply, and it's got to be hard. But that being said, I think they did a brilliant job on some seasons, and I was thoroughly disappointed with the last season. So, how about you?
Okay, a couple of things about that. I guess that the fact that you haven't read the books before watching the series was a blessing, because because for readers, I mean, it was just torture from season 5 onwards. But anyway, the other side of things here is that. I mean, if I force myself to try to make sense of how they created series and how they developed them, I mean, even in terms of how things ended, I mean, I guess that one of the things that you can do with fictional stories is that there's always a way of making sense of whatever happens. If you just go back and pick the relevant elements from back in the story to create a sort of coherent or cohesive narrative until there. And that's also why you have different people interpreting the same story in different ways, because different people pay attention to different elements, let's say. And so, I mean, did it make sense for Daenerys to go berserk and burn down King's Landing just because she heard the bell tolling or something like? I mean, given a certain perspective, or if you take a certain perspective, let's say, maybe it does, and that's probably why there's still many people that didn't find any mistake with the series, or I mean, and they didn't think there was anything wrong with it. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but basically,
I do, yeah.
But basically, what you find these very frequently, that even people, even writers and critics, I mean, different people look at the same thing in different way, and they emphasize different bits of the story, different elements, and things like that. And so at the end of the day, it can still make sense, at least to certain people. So.
I think you're right, but at the same time, I feel like they didn't do an adequate job of building up to that. I think that, I mean, that I'm willing to entertain that she could have done that, but they didn't bring me there. Do you know what I'm saying? They, for me at least, as a viewer, they didn't bring me to that place. She was Daenerys, and then she became bad Daenerys, crazy Daenerys. And there was no sort of build-up The only thing that you knew is you knew that she came from a family of people who went mad.
Right.
But you know, it kind of stretched credibility for me to have her be this one character, and then all of a sudden they put dark circles under her eyes with makeup, and she was mad. You know, that just didn't make any sense to me, and it wasn't satisfying. And you know, I would have liked to have seen it done differently. Let's put it that way. I'd have liked to have had a more of a build-up. If you're going to go there, go there. But you have to take me there. You have to build the ladder, you know, that allows me to get to that place with this character that you know, I've grown very fond of, and I mean that I think that I've grown to understand. Let's put it that way, and that I've you know, developed an empathy for, and that I've developed you know, a story in my mind for, and I don't know, I felt like they just rushed it, you know, and decided that it was all already there. I felt like they decided that they had already you know, put all the elements into place, and all they had to do was make her go crazy. And I don't agree. I don't know. I don't think all of the elements were there.
Right. I guess that there are other things where you can get evidence that they really rushed things and they didn't do things properly. Like, for example, they introduced a lot of new elements that were for nothing. Like, for example, when they introduced the fact that Cersei was pregnant, I mean, that didn't change anything in the story. Why did they do that? I mean, if at least when they got Missandei, Tyrion went to her and was able to convince her to not kill her, and things have changed because of that. But I mean, that would also not make sense. That would be out of character for Cersei to be convinced by something like that. So they introduced the pregnancy, and then they didn't explore it at all in any way that was significant for the narrative at all.
None.
So, and then there were other things, like, for example, in the season 7 finale, they were talking about the Golden Company coming to Westeros, and so they were hyping up the Golden Company, and then what did they do? They were just there to die. I mean, burned by the dragons, just to have more people there dying. They didn't change anything.
That's it. And also the whole March of the Dead that we'd been experiencing throughout all of the seasons. It was just like, okay, there's a big battle, totally anticlimactic. Oh, and now we've got to go get Cersei. You know, is she the real villain? I mean,
and that's the thing, because the entire series started with the scene about the White Walkers. It seemed like the most important element of the story was transcending politics, right? Because
and they became like a special effects gimmick in the end. You know?
Right.
Just something fun to have there. Isn't that interesting? They're all undead. Well, that's not what made it interesting for me, but okay, sure.
And you know, there's that long part, particularly in season 1, season 2, season 3, and even a little bit in season 4, about the complexity of politics and all of the schemes that went around there, and that was very interesting. But
fascinating,
But since the story, I guess, from the very beginning, was pointing toward transcending politics, because there was a threat that was larger than people's petty schemes and things like that, and petty politics. it would be in the end for them to all come together, or I mean, it wouldn't be exactly like that, because there would always be people that wouldn't believe in the threat, and people that would still prefer fighting for themselves and not uniting with other people. I mean, that's okay and that's expectable. But I mean, at the end, the White Walkers were to be the biggest threat of them all, and to be the center stage of all of the things that were happening there. But they just brushed them aside in a single episode. They all died in a single episode. What was it called? The Night King didn't have any sort of significant backup story or background story. I mean, we didn't know his motives at all. And then, okay, so this doesn't matter, let's go back to the politics.
I'm so with you. I mean, there were so many ways I felt like they could have made it more satisfying. But I mean, it would have been really interesting if somehow there'd been a dual fight even going on. They could simultaneously be battling Circe and battling the undead, and then that sort of comes together, and there could be a sort of alliance, then a late coming alliance, sort of like the Allies with the Soviets, right? Who were originally with the Germans against the White Walkers. And I mean, there are so many ways that that they could have played it that I felt would have been far more interesting and satisfying. But this is the route they chose. They chose to make it a special effects gimmick, and this incredibly dark, and I mean dark as in there was no light in that episode. I could hardly see what was going on. Yeah. I mean, and then it was just over, and I honestly almost didn't finish watching the series after that, because I didn't care anymore. I really didn't care what happened. And I finished watching it just to watch it, because I thought, well, and I was watching it with my son, and so that part was enjoyable. And I was like, well, I guess I'll finish watching it. But I didn't need to. After I finished, after the White Walker episode, I really could have stopped right there, and I wouldn't have missed anything. I could have just gotten a summary and rolled my eyes, But
well, I guess that we must hope that George R.R. Martin will finish the series or the saga in a much more fulfilling kind of way. So, because I mean,
I suspect he will.
Because I mean, you can even compare it with other fiction that is also audio-visual, like, for example, The Lord of the Rings, that in some ways resembles the story that George R.R. Martin is exploring there, not in other ways, but anyway, there are a lot of common elements there. And if you look at the movies and at the books, I mean, it's not that things are straightforward in the sense that there are the good guys and the bad guys, and the good guys are all allied and things like. I mean, they have that huge threat coming from Sauron and the orcs and Saruman and people like that. But at the same time, as the story progresses, he talks a lot about, more in the books, of course, because he has more time to do that, but he talks a lot about even historically the conflicts between the different factions, the elves and the dwarves and the men, and why the hobbits weren't, at least until then, that important or that significant, and then they become a huge deal. And I mean, even when they are about to go through to the last battle, I mean, there's still a lot of conflict going there, and they are not certain if they will be all allied in the end, and if the elves from that place and that place over there will go to their aid. And I mean, and even after that, there's still some conflict, because there are some conflicts of interest, and there are still old wounds, let's say, that haven't closed well enough, let's say, and people also have to deal with that. But so I guess that what I'm trying to say is that even if the story is about trying to transcend people's limitations because they only think about their in-group or about their nation or something like that, and bringing them all together to face a common threat. I mean, even inside that alliance, you can still explore conflicts between people, and you don't have to sacrifice the final victory of the people you want to win just because they are not all perfectly alive, let's say.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be all tied up in a neat bow. You can hint at, one of the things that's interesting about it is the sort of the hint at conflict after the story ends too, that not everything has been resolved or can be resolved. I mean, one of the things that I grew up in this very dramatic family. I was telling you a little bit about that, of political refugees. And I mean, my mother was named an enemy of the state when she was 12. Right. And so, all these people who were victims of incredible historical wins, and so as a result, I kind of got to see how people behave under these extreme circumstances. And some people are heroes and some people are cowards. Some people are villains, but most people are somewhere in between. And it's interesting to see someone behave very heroically in one instance and then say utterly fail their own children, or be perhaps kind of cowardly in one situation and then rise to the occasion in a way you would never expect in another. And that is something that I find very compelling in fiction. And that's why, that's what you and I have been talking about, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. And one of the things that makes those series so delicious is that, the authors have the courage and the ability to make a character that embodies all of these traits, and that those traits come out to play depending upon the circumstance. Even when that character is, say, a good character, is one of the people that you're rooting for, you can watch them stumble. And you can see yourself in that too. And, I find that, so incredibly seductive, as a reader. I'm so drawn in by that. And, those are the books. I mean, there are all sorts of fun books, and it's certainly fun to read stuff like Superman, someone who is good all the time and who has superpowers. So, there's definitely a place for that. But the books that bring me into a world, really bring me into a world that I feel is three-dimensional for me and that I could almost see myself stepping into, are the ones, like Lord of the Rings, like that series, like Tolkien series, and like Game of Thrones, and even like Diana Gabaldon's Outlander, which are also big, thick books. And it takes you there. Movies like Dr. Zhivago, I didn't like the book as much, but I liked the movie quite a bit. That, bring you into these extreme circumstances and show you the way people behave, in all of these sort of different milieus and with different people. And you watch someone, like in the case of Dr. Zhivago, he is a fundamentally good man who has a good marriage, and yet he has this extramarital affair that's also a beautiful love affair. And I think that would be really hard for a reader to forgive, but the circumstances are so extraordinary that, you end up loving all of the people involved. You end up feeling a real connection to, both his wife Tanya, right, and his mistress Lara. You sort of love them equally, and you see them as you see them both as good people, and you see Zhivago as a good person doing his best, and that's what makes that such a compelling story, and then you have something. You have other stories where people perhaps don't behave quite as honorably and maybe under less compelling circumstances, and we watch that unfold, and that's also fascinating. But anyway, I have a really hard time, I think, with stories that make no attempt, unless they're cartoons, which is something, which is a wholly different genre, but stories that make no attempt to show humanity as it really is. Mm-hmm. I kind of get bored. I glaze over when we're just shown an ideology, perhaps, or humanity purely as you'd like to see it, or in a way that only flatters your point of view. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And that bit about stories showing humanity as it really is, I mean, even that is a bit tricky, right? Because I guess that one of the things that people also don't want from their stories is for them to be real as reality is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they want them to be real enough, but not really real as their lives are, let's say, because there are lots of things that happen in our lives that, for example, don't make sense, or that we don't like, or
exactly.
or I mean, it's not that in stories there can't happen things that that we don't like, or that we feel bad about, or something like that. It's that in stories, if that happens, it has to be integrated into a sort of larger narrative that gives meaning to that bad thing that's happened. That is something that we very rarely have in life. I mean, if we do, we have to come up with the meaning to it, because there's nothing out there, I guess, or something that is really part of the event itself. Yeah. That gives it meaning. It is us ourselves that have to do that kind of work, right?
No, you're right, and I think when you look at something like beauty, for instance, which is a huge element of fiction, right? And I really do mean physical beauty. It's very difficult to write a story, say, about two lovers, and you're not going to make the hero flatulent, for instance, and you're not going to put a really big pimple on the heroine's cheek. That even though those are very real elements, right, that does take a reader out of it and takes that fantasy element that you're talking about, because you're right, there is this balance. There is showing a reader in an entertaining way what humanity is like under certain circumstances, perhaps under extreme circumstances that one might experience in much smaller ways in our own lives, right? But there are also these elements that compel us in other ways, and beauty is hugely compelling for us as human beings, and I think that rightly so. I think that and I'm not just talking about another human being's beauty, about their physical beauty. When we walk out into nature, when we see some beautiful vista, when we, look at our dog, my dog who's back here making a lot of noise, and we might see the beauty of an animal and just the beauty of form. Those things really do move us, and they create empathy. I think beauty does create empathy. And so it's an incredible device. Excuse me, my dog.
Oh, there's the guy.
and if I didn't give him that attention, he would have made a lot of noise. But but you know, so beauty becomes this in you know, powerful element in a story, and yet in many respects it's not very realistic because most people are not fantastically beautiful. So sorry about that. So you know, it is this balance that someone who is trying to create something meaningful for people to experience, who's trying to you know, write a novel, build a world, television series, whatever it is. These are all elements that that have to be taken into account, and it's what makes the creative process so complicated. It is what makes it an art and not simply, you know, if you could just do a paint by numbers and follow, you know, these steps the way you might, you know, buy a chair at IKEA and put it together in your home and it looks just like it does in the picture, well, then that would make it all easy. I mean, look at Game of Thrones. The two men, I can't remember their names, good Lord, who produced the series are incredibly talented individuals, and yet here we are talking about how they utterly failed in George R.R. Martin's vision in the last season especially, but maybe from season 5 on, right? And it just goes to show you how complicated the creative process is and how you can't just tinker with it. I mean, what is it? I was watching, I was either listening to a podcast or I was watching something on YouTube. It was actually about the creative process, and people were talking about the way pitches in Hollywood, you know, the way you're pitching something, and that the people you're pitching to often don't understand that you can't just throw something in there just because they want it in there. Mm-hmm. You know, well, I think we need a female character right here, for instance. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, but it's about two men trapped in the wild alone together who might end up eating each other because they have no food. So where are we going to, how are we going to bring a woman into this? You know, it's things like that of people who don't say, well, I don't know, but I think we need a woman in this story. You know, it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the creative process and of the story being told, you know, and that, and how, you know, and how a story evolves in, say, a writer's or a filmmaker's mind, and that it's not always a direct reflection of their own beliefs, for instance, which I think is really hard for people to understand, which is why what you're saying, you know, that where people think, how can you write a sympathetic murderer, for instance, you know, and people do say that, how could you write something, how could you write sympathetically about this person who did all these terrible things? And somehow, you know, some may believe that you actually literally are sympathetic to what they're doing and not to them as a human being. It's like, well, no, I'm really not sympathetic to somebody who hunts people down and ties them up in their basement and murders them. I'm quite sympathetic to the victim, but I'm fascinated at how they got that way. I'm fascinated as to why they did it and how that person could also have functioning relationships with other people in their lives. My brother, this is kind of an interesting off story, but my brother's a psychologist and he works for the prison system. Mm-hmm. And he's been working with really hardcore criminals for 20 years, maybe. You know, he ran death row in Florida, and then he ran the mental health division for like 20 federal prisons. And a couple of years ago, he calls me, and you know, and I said, "Oh, so what's going on?" Because I love hearing his stories; they're just fascinating. And he said, "Well, something interesting is actually going on." He said, "A therapist who works for me, it turns out he's a serial killer." And I said, what? He said, yeah, that's exactly how I felt. And I said, how well did you know him? He said, actually, I knew him very well because we would have to, once a week, we would have to sit down for at least an hour and really go over in detail, what is going on with each prisoner. And he said, and he was a very good therapist. And he said, and of all the people I work with, he's the guy I would have liked to have seen socially. He's like, the only reason I didn't is, my brother has 6 kids. He's like, I don't have time to really have much of a social life. I've got a lot of responsibilities. He's got a big job and he's got a lot of children and an active family life. But I just thought, okay, so not only do you have a serial killer working for you, but you liked this guy and you wanted to be his friend. So, that's the stuff of great fiction too. And, that's when I think that's when reality becomes actually a lot like fiction, I think, because that's something that feels like could never happen. And yet it did. And so, I find it fascinating the way fiction plays with us in that way, because yes, there are all these ways in which we may separate ourselves from, say, what we're watching on television in a great series or reading in a book, and say, well, that really wouldn't happen in real life because real life is so unpredictable. And yet there are also so many times when we see something happen in real life and we think, a writer couldn't have come up with this. This feels like fiction, and it's that play of walking between those worlds too that's so fascinating, and that I think draws people in, because there's always that sense of, well, it could happen,
right?
That
I was just wondering if it could be the case that what people want from stories and fiction is that they want a version of reality that is condensed, in the sense that all of the things that they would give meaning to in their lives would be condensed into, for example, a book or a movie or a piece of theater, or whatever medium. Because if you think about it, one of the things that people want the most in their lives is for their lives to have some sort of meaning, right?
Yes.
And we all struggle a lot to give meaning to our lives, mainly, I guess, because every day we have to do 1,000 boring, repetitive things that, if we think about them, they don't have any sort of meaning, and that's why you can't find them in good literature, because you wouldn't be describing, for example, a guy waking up and going to the subway, and then he looks down, he looks up, he looks to the wall, he looks down, he looks up, while he's waiting for the subway to come. So it seems to me that it should be something like that, because basically all of the things that people find dead boring, let's say, because there are, of course, some elements in fiction that are a little bit boring, but people also go through them because they tell something important about what's happening there. And perhaps it's a distilled version of reality where all of the unnecessary elements that people have to deal with and that work, let's say, as obstacles in their lives for them to think, oh, okay, so this life that I'm living, this is wonderful, just meaningful things happening in my life, positive ones and negative ones, they're all meaningful. So, I was just wondering if that's what people want from fiction.
I think so. I think that's certainly one of the many elements they want from fiction. I think that the whole process of entering into a possible world it satisfies exactly what you're talking about. You were talking about, most people just going to the subway, right? Now, for most of us, we go to the subway, look at our watch maybe, or our phones now. You wait, you look up, you get on the subway, you sit down, maybe you read your book, and then you find yourself at work. Mm-hmm. Now, but some days you might get on the subway and there's a crazy guy singing.
Right.
Or there's a beautiful girl. Now, most of the time, the crazy guy singing just sings. He doesn't turn into a demon and take you on a trip, right, into Hades, and then you experience the 9 circles of hell. And most of the time, you don't really get to meet the beautiful girl. You just watch her from afar, and you think, wow, I sure would like to meet her. Maybe I can figure out a way to bump into her and start up a conversation. But most of the time, that doesn't even happen, because that takes a tremendous amount of courage to do something like that. And also, we often don't have time. We're headed somewhere. I don't have time to strike up a conversation with this girl. I sure would like to, but I've got to be at work in 15 minutes or whatever it is. And fiction, I think, takes us into those possible worlds. Harry Potter starts off, living in a cupboard under the stairs, having this droll life, and then a letter comes. And that's the call to adventure, right? It's the call to adventure that's in any great story. And, we're all waiting for our call to adventure, especially when we're young. That call to adventure might be traveling or going off to school. There's this great, you've probably never seen it, because I doubt it ran. I don't think it ran internationally, but it's old. I mean, I think it's from the mid 1990s. There was this company called Monster.com, and it was an online job service where you looked for a job. It was the first of its kind, and it got bought up by some other company, so it doesn't exist anymore. But they had the most brilliant ad. It had little kids saying things like, when I grow up, I want to be a middle manager. When I grow, all these horrible, boring, non-aspirational things that many of us grow up to be, right? But it was really perfect, because it was saying, no, don't settle for that. Nobody says, when I grow up, I want to be a middle manager. No, you want to rule the world. You want to be a best-selling author. You want to be a movie star. You want to be a baseball player for the major leagues. Come to Monster.com. Let go of your boring, terrible life that's driving you insane. Stop going to that job that you hate, where you just punch your time card and then you sit there and type up silly memos all day. Go to Monster. Make your dreams come true. Become who you always wanted to be, right? And that's, they really tapped into that call to adventure. And so I think that's really, what you're talking about with the separation from reality. I think the reality that's reflected is often that sort of mundane reality that we all start off in, right? And that we all live in to some extent, even those of us who do love our jobs and do love what we do. You love doing this. I love doing this. This is really fun. But still, we have hours of mundane work in our lives that we have to do that it would be obviously a lot more fun spent, climbing a mountain or following a demon into Hades, as long as we get out, right? or any one of these things. And I think as human beings, we're always looking to see and wondering how we would respond under extreme circumstances. I think it's why young men and women are drawn to war. Nobody really wants to be shot at. Mm-hmm. It's horrifying. Yeah. But at the same time, you want to know what you're made of. Mm-hmm. And it's something that we explore on the page. It's something that we explore, in a movie or in a television series, whatever it is. It's why hospitals, police dramas, and wars will always make their way into fiction because they bring us to places that are extreme, and we're dying to know what we're going to be like under those circumstances. We are just dying to know. And the truth of the matter is that those circumstances are satisfying, even when they do really happen to us. And that's the dirty little secret. Because I don't know anyone who's been to war that describes it as a purely bad experience. There are many elements that they hate about it, of course, but they might talk about the camaraderie. I mean, my father-in-law went to, he was my husband's the youngest of 8 children, so my father-in-law was much older, and he went to Marine Corps reunions. He was a World War II Marine. He went to Marine Corps reunions until his health gave out. He did not have a lot of money, and yet he would save his pennies if the Marine Corps reunion was in Hawaii, which was an unbelievable expense for him. This was a man who was blue collar, and he had 8 children. And yet he went to Hawaii to go to the Marine Corps reunion.
Right.
And his friends from the Marine Corps were from all over the place and from every social class. And yet when they got together, they were equals. And, these are, my youngest child was born very ill, for instance, and awful experience. I mean, really an awful experience, but not entirely awful either. There was a great beauty to it. People who I didn't even know who came out of the woodwork to help us. Just, I remember this woman, I hardly knew her. My older 2 children were in preschool with her twins. And she just showed up at my house and said, I'm going to take your kids to an amusement park today. So that I could spend the day alone with my baby who was going through chemotherapy. And she went and she took my kids to an amusement park. And she dropped them off late at night. I mean, it was like 8 p.m. when she brought them back. She'd fed them all day. She'd taken them out. I hardly knew her. I mean, I was so grateful. And then and on top of it, she came in and she said, I don't know if I told you this, but I'm a child psychiatrist. She was a Yale-trained child psychiatrist, right? And she said, and I just want you to know that whatever you're doing it right, because they could be a real disaster right now, and they're not. They feel like you're in charge, and that their world is not going to fall apart. I don't even know if this woman still lives in town. I think she and her husband moved. That's how little I knew her, and yet she performed this incredible service for me. And she did it without expecting anything in return. And, a couple of years later, I ran into her husband at the playground. And, I had no idea that was her husband. And he told me his name. And I said, oh, is this your wife? And I said, yeah. And I told him that story. He had no idea who I was. He'd never even heard of me. You know what I mean? And I said, I just want to ask you to thank her, because that meant so much to me. And I think I thanked her then, but I don't even remember, because I was sort of in a fog, and what she did meant everything. And it was just one day. It's experiences like that are incredibly meaningful. And it is why I think, a world without pain is just a wasteland. It never brings us to those places. And I think that fiction also has a role, it plays that role, because if we are not experiencing that level of intensity in our lives, and we can't maintain that level of intensity, right? Nobody wants to keep going through these awful experiences. That's incredibly taxing. But one way that we can experience them and imagine ourselves in those situations is through fiction, and is through these very, very complicated narratives that that I think help expand our self-knowledge.
Right.
You know?
So yeah, you were talking about war, and I mean, of course, in this conversation, I'm also trying to leave morality aside because I mean, it doesn't make sense to talk about literary stuff and even sometimes to be serious about how the world really is and how people experience the world, always with the burden of looking moralistically, let's say, at things, because I mean, people are not there's only a very tiny percentage of people in the world and in society that are true psychopaths, and I mean, people are not stupid. So there's one very real and good reason why throughout history good literature always included elements of war. It's because war is deadly meaningful. I mean, there's almost nothing in life that is as meaningful as participating in war, because all of the things that you care the most about are there. I mean, you're trying to protect your country, your community, your family, your wife, your children, your own life, the life of your comrades. I mean, you're killing other people that even though it's awful, it's seriously meaningful. And I mean, and then there's also that element, and I guess that's why people in the military have those sorts of things, where people kind of lose themselves individually in the collective, in the sense that they have all of those synchronic activities like marching at the same pace and chanting and moving at the same speed and things like that. And I mean, and all of those things combined, I mean, at the end of the day, even if we look at it and we can look at it from our modern moral lenses, let's say, we can think, oh, that's awful, people are dying, people are getting injured, people are destroying resources, people are killing old people, children, women, destroying all sorts of things and so on. But, okay, that's true, but at the end of the day, it's still a grandiose place to be, because all of what's meaningful is combined into that space.
There's a reason that they call a battlefield a theater. You know, I don't know if you have the same in Portuguese, if you have that same expression, but
yes, we have.
Yeah, you know, it would be interesting to see how many languages express a battlefield the same way, wouldn't it? Because that seems to me to be a you know, such an accurate description, and it's you're absolutely right. I mean, every single compelling human experience seems to happen on a battlefield. I knew this woman some years ago who was an aunt of a friend of mine, and she was a Holocaust survivor, and she had this really compelling story. She'd been an artist, and she was chosen by Joseph Mengele, who was the doctor at Auschwitz, the sort of evil doctor, the angel of death, they called him. He forced her to come and paint his medical experiments on gypsies because she was a wonderful painter. And he didn't like photography because he thought it was a peasant's medium. And so she has this incredibly, you know, harrowing story. She and her mother survived 2 death marches, all of this. And she would talk about how some of the most marvelous people she ever met, she met in the concentration camp. And that it was that when she and her mother got off the bus after liberation, after they'd been liberated from Auschwitz, and they were taken by bus back to Prague, and everyone they knew was dead, and several of the people on the bus had been politicals, so they still had family, had been political and not had been Jewish, so their whole families had not necessarily been exterminated, for instance. And she said she remembers getting off the bus, and there were all these people waiting for the other people, family members, friends, and it was just she and her mother standing there, and she turned to her mother and said, "I want to go back." I'm sorry, that makes me really emotional to hear that, because she told this story to me personally, and I've also seen her tell it on the Holocaust. She's been videotaped for the Shoah Foundation. That's it, for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. Her story, and she told me the story in person, and it was an incredibly emotional story, because I got it. I absolutely understood what she was talking about. I want to go back. I want to go back to this place of heightened emotion, where I saw people be the worst they can be, but I also watched people be the best they can be. And obviously she did not mean that literally. She was thrilled to be liberated. I mean, she barely survived, and was anemic and ill, and all of the things that you would imagine someone who'd spent several months in a concentration camp, how they would be physically. But these are incredibly moving and I think vital experiences for us. And what was interesting is when she would be asked to go speak at events, talking about the Holocaust, she said people would literally, the people who were organizing the event would say to her, "You're not allowed to say there's anything good about the experience." And right. She would look at them and say, "What are you talking about? Of course there's something good about the experience. That's what makes this compelling." She was an artist, so she certainly felt that way. And they'd say, you are not allowed to do that. It was all bad. And if you talk about it in any way that makes it sort of a more expansive experience, I think, obviously they were afraid that would in any way give any kind of glory to the experience, but that wasn't what she was doing at all. And I think that fear is really misguided, and it's something that I think that we hear people talking about now when there is a criticism, for instance, made of. I'm trying to think of an actual example, but it feels like there are just so many. Criticisms made of say movies that might glorify war, or books that might glorify a masculine perspective, for instance. There's this fear that if we talk about something, that somehow it gives it validity instead of helping us self-reflect, instead of helping us really think through it and play intellectually with those concepts. And I just think it's misguided, because I think we all, of course, know that these very difficult experiences are conflicted and offer many different experiences for us. They are not just one kind of experience, and that's also what makes, say, world building and walking into a world such a compelling experience, because it's not only a sensory experience, it's not only atmospheric, where we might see dragons in this world, for instance, which kind of is part of that call to adventure, but it also lays out all the different elements of our psyche.
Yeah. While you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Because, I mean, the things he talks about there, I mean, I can't even imagine going through that. But at the same time, weirdly enough, there's an element of beauty to it. Because I mean, the things...
Stunning beauty.
Particularly when he talks about those people that he says are infinitely more admirable than he himself is, because they stood there firmly and they never abandoned their morality and their integrity. I mean, for me, those people are saints, and
me too, because
and that's that. Because
I have no illusion that I would be one of them. I don't know. Chances are I wouldn't be, because most of us aren't. I'd like to be.
Well, I'm almost 100% certain that I wouldn't be one of them.
I think I'm almost 100% certain I wouldn't be one of them too. It's true. It's same as, I don't know if you've read Primo Levi or Czesław Miłosz. Primo Levi is an Italian concentration camp survivor, and Czesław Miłosz is Polish and writes more about the Soviets. But it's also very similar. And I read an essay some years ago. I can't even remember who it was by, but Primo Levi ended up committing suicide late in life. And this essay was about the fact that Primo Levi could never get over his time in the concentration camp because it was there was so much intensity to that experience that the rest of his life could not match that intensity, and it brought him into a deep depression. Mm-hmm. And I read that when I was very young, and I remember being fascinated by that concept that that you could be brought into a place of despair, not just because of a painful experience, but because of the lack of a painful experience. Mm-hmm. And that the specter of that experience is greater than just the pain itself. It is about that intensity. And I think that is a very dangerous concept for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It feels dangerous. I don't actually think it is dangerous at all. I think that I think it's fascinating, and I think that it's something that I love to explore. But I think that at its core is very frightening to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about things like war and the gulags and concentration camps and the most awful things humanity has ever come up with. But I mean, of course, I don't want to go to war, and I don't want to go to a
neither do I.
And I don't want to do that to other people. I mean, that's awful. I guess that what we're talking about here is that. I mean, George R.R. Martin also talks about this. He says that, for example, in war, you see the worst and the best of people at the same time. So, and I mean, and it's interesting because even when we look back in history and even nowadays to the people we admire the most, I mean, I can't think of one single person that has made something meaningful or significant in history that hasn't gone through awful things in their lives. So I don't know if you think about political leaders and political activists like Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and Gandhi. I mean, they went through so many awful things in their lives that sometimes it's almost unimaginable how they managed to keep their head sane, let's say, because I mean, Because it seems that it's only in those sorts of situations and not simply in everyday mundane life that people really are able to bring out the best that they have to give to the world, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's that saying, war makes a good man great. You know, we were just, I was recently watching Ken Burns. I don't know if you know who Ken Burns is. He's a documentary filmmaker here in the U.S. and he did a really big series on the Vietnam War. He did one on jazz.
Okay. Yeah, I know who he is. Yeah.
And he did one on the Civil War, and and we were just watching the one on the Civil War. You know, we live in Virginia, and so many of the key battles happened here. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a friend of ours, his ancestor, the war began at his house and ended at his house. The treaties were actually signed at his home. And so we'd never watched the Ken Burns Civil War series, and we thought, well, we have to do this, right? Even though, I mean, we're transplants to the South. My husband and I are both from the Midwest. But I really became interested in the story of Ulysses S. Grant, who was the Union general who won the war, because even though he went to West Point, he'd basically been a ne'er-do-well. I mean, he wasn't a very good businessman. He drank a lot. He really wasn't very good at anything except war. Right. And he cared deeply about his men. I don't mean he, was great at war because he was this killing machine or anything like that. He was an incredibly nuanced person who cared deeply about what he was doing and cared deeply about preserving the Union. He cared deeply about keeping his men alive and having them come home whole. And yet he was so good at this. Within a year's time, he quite literally went from being a clerk at a little store in the middle of nowhere, working for his dad and not even doing very well at it, and drinking way too much, to leading the Union Army and then becoming the president of the United States. It's incredible, but these extreme circumstances show us what we're made of. Yeah. And that can be also, this incredibly empowering experience. And for some people, it can be utterly transformative. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's also something that is incredibly important, to us as people, but also, is such an incredibly important element of fiction is transformation. Mm-hmm. Is, watching a character go from here to here. Yeah. And watching that mechanism, because we struggle to change in our own lives. We struggle to change those elements of our personality that maybe don't serve us very well. Maybe that is being afraid of conflict. And so we're afraid to come to our boss and ask for a raise, or ask for more responsibility, or whatever it is, or perhaps we bring that into our relationships, or perhaps we're bullies, or whatever it is, whatever our particular personality quirks are. We struggle to change those. We struggle to become better people, to become a person that other people talk about favorably. And, I think that we are always in some way looking at what our story looks like to others. And I think this has become really plain on social media, where people have become their own sort of PR machines, right? Especially on mediums like Facebook or whatever, where, you have these you have these perfect Facebook families that you see of people who are always like, it's like they're on a sitcom all the time. And you know, their vacations are fantastic. They're always smiling. They're always dressed well. And it's trying to make a story of your life that other people will buy, right? And that you will buy, that perhaps, and I don't think it's purely for other people. I think that in some sense, we feel that if we put that out there, that maybe we'll live up to it too. And anyway, I think fiction does the same thing. I think that we are constantly looking for ways in which we can watch a transformation happen, so that we can understand that mechanism. How do I do that? You know, how do I change? How do I bring myself to that point? How do I go from being this sad person, this loser in my own eyes, to a winner? You know, to the person who gets the girl or the guy, to the person who gets the job, to the person who people are talking about in a way that makes me feel proud.
Mm-hmm.
There's almost no story that doesn't have some element of that, you know, that we find, you know, that we get hooked on. You know, I mean, definitely Tolkien's stories are all about that. You know, Game of Thrones is all about that. Characters struggling to be,
and
you know.
And you know, it's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking that maybe another thing that fiction does is, so Nietzsche had this very interesting saying. I mean, it was a bit arrogant for him to say that, but he said that he was trying to write in a single sentence what the other philosophers took books to write, let's say, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And I guess that one element that fiction also has is the fact that good writers are able to, through a very powerful description, reach people even at a philosophical level in ways that you can't do if you write a philosophical essay or an entire philosophical book. Because, for example, one example that came to my mind right now was when I was reading the first time Dante's Divine Comedy and the first part, Inferno, and then Dante arrived at the lowest circle of hell, and he was saying how people there were in a frozen lake, basically, and they were frozen up to different levels in their body. And then there was the devil, the three-headed devil with the devil. I guess it was Judas and Brutus, I guess the guy that betrayed Caesar. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I was just completely struck by that, because I thought this guy is a complete genius, because he not only arranged a perfect metaphor for what he was trying to convey there, putting people in a frozen lake where they couldn't move and they couldn't have any sort of contact with other people, and so that would be the worst form of punishment ever, even worse than being cut and being buried and being, I mean, all of those awful things that he talks about in the book, but also because it shows betrayal as the worst sin of them all. So I mean, that's just a stroke of genius, I guess.
I agree, and the whole, and also just being frozen, it to me at least seems like a perfect metaphor for depression.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That to me seems physically how depression feels. You know, that you can't move. Mm-hmm. And you don't even know why you can't move, but you can't. You're stuck. You're stuck in a pattern of thought. You're stuck in a mood. And I love that. And you're right. That is absolute genius. Because when you are able to create a metaphor for something that is so complete, that is so perfectly painted in every possible shade that reflects a feeling on such a deep and instinctive level, there's no slogan that can help you feel that. There's nothing that provides that level of immediacy and emotional connection other than a perfectly executed concept, let's say. Whether it is a sort of imaginative, fictional, creative concept, or whether it's a philosophical concept. Whatever it is, that's what I think anybody who is a creative person, and I'm using that very broadly. I don't just mean people who are artists or artsy, but anyone who is a creative person is striving for that, is really trying to get to the heart of a matter, is trying deeply to understand what motivates. It's not just motivation of feeling. It's not just motivation of thought. I think that it is deeply instinctive. I think that it goes even deeper than that. It's maybe what we call gut feelings, but it's what we respond to whether we like it or not. And what might even make us cringe because we find ourselves maybe responding to something that's not palatable. I loved all the sort of controversy around the novel 50 Shades of Grey. I found it so fascinating because it made people so emotional. They were the fans who were so passionate about it. And then there were the people who were so furious about it. They were absolutely furious that this was, that this became a phenomenon. They were furious because it was badly written. They were furious because it was anti-feminist or whatever. They were furious because, it was playing into every stereotype. They were absolutely furious about it. But at the same time, you're like, let's look at this. Let's face this. This is a perfect storm. This is so interesting. One way or another, we are all responding to this. And we're all dancing to this tune. There's got to be a reason why. And it's not, it's not because this was forced down our throats by a marketing machine, for instance. We picked this up all on our own. And why is that? Yeah. I'm forever interested in the sort of myths that never, ever, ever go away. No matter how hard we try, no matter how many treatises are written about how destructive they have been to humanity and to our psyches, no matter how unfashionable they become, there are certain myths which simply will not die. They've been a part of us. They've been a part of us since the dawn of time, since the dawn of humanity, at least, if not the dawn of time. And they, even when we attempt to destroy them, they come back, perhaps in another form.
Yeah, and it's interesting because many of those myths, and maybe some people, if we're talking about characters, would call them archetypes, following the Jungian terminology, let's say. I guess that it's interesting that some of those things are successful across different social groups and people from different socioeconomic status and people with widely different educational backgrounds, because, for example, there are things like and that people that are perhaps more intellectual, let's say, they think that those sorts of things are a bit silly, but there are things like romance novels and I mean, for men, of course, more hardcore pornography that, I mean, it almost doesn't matter what type of person you are, what is your socioeconomic status, if you went to college or not. I mean, you can always find women and men all across the social strata that like those sorts of things. And even historically, I mean, and it seems that they will always like it.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the romance genre. I find the romance genre absolutely fascinating. Here you have a genre that is read cross-culturally and across class and racial lines entirely. I mean, it's absolutely, you know, everybody, a PhD will read the same romance novel that, say, an uneducated woman who, you know, works at a call center or whatever, or has an intellectually undemanding job, will read. And it's, you know, we talked about this a little bit. I think we talked about it over email or something, or direct message, how you know, you have these people all reading the same story because they all have, you know, the common dream of love, but it's more than that too, because they're all reading the same types of stories. I mean, many different kinds of women read 50 Shades of Grey, and everyone will admit it's not a literary masterpiece, you know. You know, even the women who you know, really enjoyed it, who you know, are incredibly well read and you would think are not really interested, and they'll go, oh, I've read the whole series, you know. I read every single one of them, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, you know. And it's one of the reasons, I mean, I'm writing this sort of epic romance with fantasy elements right now. I usually write these historical Cold War thrillers, which I also love to write, but I decided that I was going to try my hand at a really epic romance, you know. And I mean, to be fair, it still has like war and all of the things that I love in it. So it's not, you know, a straight out romance. It's a romance a lot more in the realm of if you know, maybe Outlander or something like that, which has so many other things going on. It has history and it has all of that. But the fact is, I wanted to make the core of the story about these two lovers, which was never a place that I expected to go as a writer, because I just wasn't really, not that I'm not interested in relationships. All of my books have, I think, a meaningful relationship in them, but I never thought that I would be writing something that was so relationship centric, let's put it that way. And what got me writing it was that on my blog, I whenever I wrote about love, people wrote in. I mean, so, you know, they would always write to me, but they'd write to me personally. You know, they'd email me. It wasn't just they would comment on the actual essay on my blog. Oftentimes they wouldn't. Oftentimes they would skip that and they would just come to me personally and they would tell me their love stories, right? Mm-hmm. And what I found really interesting about it was that most of the people who wrote to me, the ones who told me really detailed emotional love stories, were men. Oh. I found that I was really surprised by that. And it's not that women wouldn't write to me and tell me their love stories. They would, but they tended not to go into the level of detail. And they tended not to bare their souls as much. And I don't know if that's because maybe, you know, women kind of tend to talk about that stuff more and they have people with whom to talk about those things with. They talk about maybe they talk with their other friends or their mothers, whatever it is. And maybe men just don't have that outlet. And I'm a safe outlet because they never have to meet me. You know, they never have to see me in their own lives, right? But yet they can, would write these like single-spaced 3-page detailed stories, love stories to me. And they were incredibly moving, for one thing, and it was also a really fascinating dynamic for me. And so I started really looking into, well, what makes a really compelling male character? What is it about a male character that really has this character be a man that other men want to be, and be a man that women want to be with? Right. And I started thinking about these two groups of men that I met. And this one group I met when I was much, much younger, and they were war photographers. And they were incredibly charismatic, as you can imagine. You know, they had great stories, right? And they were wild. You know, I mean, they were always out there having sex with women and taking mushrooms and, you know what I mean? And just having a wild time. But they were really wild guys. And yet they had these really dangerous jobs, and they were very courageous. And they were willing to put themselves into incredibly dangerous situations that required, more than courage. It required a deep grit. I don't know how else to describe this, but it required a very archetypically masculine response to a situation. And then I also got to know a group of soldiers. There were men in the Marine Corps through one of my husband's close friends, who's now a 3-star general in the Marine Corps. And both of these men were very courageous. Both of these groups of men were very courageous, and both these men had no problem getting women. You know, but as I was looking at the two groups, I was thinking to myself, okay, if I went into a bar and these two groups of men were there, who would I be drawn to more? What is it about these two groups of men? And, you know, which one of them would I be drawn to more? And I ended up thinking I probably would have been drawn to the soldiers more. And there was one basic reason for that. And it was because they seemed to be executing to a higher calling, if that makes sense. They had a vision of something greater than themselves that they were executing to. And one of the things that I thought was quite interesting about the men who I knew, and that, granted, these are small control groups. These are really only two groups of men that I knew. I didn't do any kind of extensive research, but the war photographers, I remember having conversations with them about how, like, sometimes I wonder what I'm even doing there. Mm-hmm. Because here I am taking pictures. What am I doing? What is this? How am I helping the situation? And I think that the Marines had a very clear idea of what they were doing there. And another element that I also found really interesting is the war photographers were very ironic. And I remember I was talking to one, and he was talking about a friend of his who had been shot by a firing squad. And he'd been a war photographer, and he'd been shot somewhere in the Middle East. And, I was like, oh my God, I said, why? Why was he shot? And this guy said, they didn't like him. He said it in a very sort of ironic, funny way. And, when you would talk to the Marines about their fallen comrades, there was no irony. They would sit back, take a deep breath, I can't remember any of them actually crying, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. You know, they weren't afraid to show their grief in any way. And I attributed that possibly, and maybe I'm wrong, to the sense that I think that they had a very clear idea of what they were doing in that circumstance and why they were doing it. Right. And it was a little more muddied in the case of this group of war photographers. I think that their vision for why they were there was not quite so clear. It's like, well, I guess I'm there to get a great picture and win a Pulitzer Prize, but no, I'm there for more than that, because I really am emotionally invested in what's going on there. And yet, you know, there's that push and pull, I think, between those two competing goals, maybe, you know, which was not present with the Marines that I could see. And so, you know, I was already then, you know, looking at that as a writer, and I was thinking, okay, so when I'm building a male character, what is the most compelling thing then about a male character that men want to be around, and men want to follow, and women want to be with? And I think that it is that sense of purpose, of I know what I am, and I know why I'm doing this, and I will execute to that. It's that very decisiveness. And anyway, so that actually, it's a long story that I've just told, but that's actually what brought me into wanting to write a love story, you know, a story about lovers, that is, because there is so much that, you know, we're going through all of these tremendous changes on the surface of roles that men and women are, you know, the changing roles of men and women. My dog is making noise, sorry. The changing roles of men and women in society, you know, and we're fighting about this. We're having, you know, you know, you know, and then I add transgenderism into this. It's all very confusing, and no one really knows what to do with it all. And yet, what are the underlying myths that we all respond to, whether we want to or not? Mm-hmm. What is it, you know, that makes us swoon, that makes us angry, you know, and it's often the same thing. Not often, but you know, it's not unusual for it to be the same thing. And so anyway, I that's why I thought, you know, I came to think that romance or romantic stories are just so ripe with everything that's going on right now, and they always are, because love is so central to our existence in one way or another, whether it's romantic love or whether it's, you know, the feelings that we have for our siblings or you know, a comrade in arms, whatever it is. And you know, it's so easy to lose sight of the things that bind us together and the things that we respond to, whether we want to or not, because we're so busy adapting to change right now. And we don't know what to make of it. And we don't know how it's going to turn out. And we might have a very rigid idea of how we want it to turn out. And we try to fit that narrative, often, you know, that square peg into a round hole. And, you know, what happens when we don't fight that? Mm-hmm. What happens, you know, when we submit to whatever it is that we're feeling about, say, love, mm-hmm. and what we feel, what we respond to when it comes to, you know, the people who make our hearts flutter. Right. And, you know, when we succumb to our greatest dreams and hopes about the fulfillment of love.
I think I've already said what I wanted. I was basically trying to ask you if you agree that when people try to politicize or moralize literature, fictional literature, too much if it doesn't seem that they get into a place where, in fact, they are not doing what they say they're doing, that is, that they are really caring about other people, about minorities, about different social groups and so on, but they are only trying to focus on what matters to them, because, I mean, every another person that is sufficiently different from them, they aren't able to portray them in a humane way. It just comes up as a sort of caricature of another human being or something like that.
I find it boring, you know. I mean, for the same, it's not. I think it's kind of narcissistic, and narcissists are boring, and not that there isn't great literature written by narcissists. I'm sure, because there is. I guess it depends on the artistry of the individual, but most of the time it's done with very little artistry or not enough artistry, and that's the problem, you know. And people start to sort of glaze over, because if, I don't know, when you have something so black and white, it starts to seem trite. You know, it's like the communist propaganda play that I was telling you about, and I was reading all of these communist propaganda plays, trying to find one that we could produce and that we could play without torturing the audience. It was really, really difficult, because, you know, and even the one we chose, you know, the monologues were utterly ridiculous. You know, they were literally so dumb. They were like, I will work for the state until I drop, you know, stuff like that, where you're listening to this thinking, oh my God, I can't even believe someone could write that with a straight face and think that they were going to convince anybody. And I think that's part of the problem, is that when you're trying really hard to convince someone, instead of letting a narrative blossom, mm-hmm. and seeing where it takes you, which is, I think, what the best artists do. And that doesn't mean that they don't have control of what's happening in the narrative. They do, but it is a process, I think, of discovery and manipulation that has to be balanced very, very carefully. And when it's out of balance, like, for instance, when you try to, you know, pigeonhole an ideology into something, whether it's a religious ideology or a political ideology, it's obvious and it's heavy-handed, and it stops being entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It just gets didactic, mm-hmm. You know. And who wants to preach that? No, I was going to say, yeah, I'm sorry, go.
No problem. I was just going to say that that's very interesting, because you were referring to, for example, being deeply religious, or better said, injecting a religious ideology mm-hmm. into the story. But it's very interesting, because good writers can create a deeply religious story, yes. without having it contaminating the whole panorama, let's say, because for example, Dante was perfectly able to do that, and it's obvious that that's a religious story, but I mean, even a secular person can perfectly well read that and take some good time and some value out of it. So.
Well, that's it, and that takes. Didn't Dante work on it until he was 80?
I'm not sure.
Something like that. I mean, boy, talk about an example of letting a narrative blossom. And no, it's true. It's not that those subject matters aren't something that an artist can tackle. It's not that you can't tackle ideology or politics or religion, for instance. But it takes, for one, even if you are passionate about that ideology, I think that it takes a tremendously open mind to write about it with any artistry. And good Lord, it's been a long time since I've read Dante, but like you said, a secular person can read it. If a secular person can read what you've written, it has undoubtedly been written by someone with an open mind, by someone who is able to imagine another side, and how someone who perhaps does not share their fervor might approach their work, and that person can never demonize that person.
Right.
Otherwise, it's alienating and it's boring. Except for the people who agree with the ideology. You've immediately alienated, half the people who would read your work, and the other half are simply being validated by you. Then, I don't understand what that brings to the conversation.
Right.
Basically, I think that it brings very little. I suppose it has its place. Everything does, but it's certainly not interesting to me. I'm willing to read anything. I'm willing to read any kind of ideology from any perspective, as long as it is written in a way that I find compelling, that I find open and engaging and entertaining. I'll go there. I love Christopher Hitchens. Do you read Christopher Hitchens? Have you read Hitchens?
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit, yeah. I loved reading Christopher Hitchens. And I'm a Catholic. My children go to Sunday school, and yet I read his takedown of Mother Teresa. What you call the missionary position, which I think is just the best. And that doesn't bother me, and I understand that it bothers a lot of people. I understand that a lot of people get physically uncomfortable, if not furious, reading something that they don't agree with, and especially in today's climate. I do understand that, and I have some empathy for it. But at the same time, I think that if you really want to create something good, you can't just be preaching to the choir. You can't just be trying to talk to your people, what you would call your people. You've got to try to transcend that at least, and to create anything of meaning. I think you have to be able to reach out. Open your arms wider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm an atheist, by the way.
Yeah, most of my friends are.
Yeah, but even when I was reading Dante, I was always thinking about, because I'm not a militant atheist. I don't care about that type of thing and being an anti-theist like some people are.
Right.
I'm not that sort of guy. And I don't care about bashing religious people's beliefs and things like that. But while I was reading it last time, I was always thinking, okay, so I guess that a true militant atheist would be somewhat bothered by the fact that he was talking about how people would be punished for eternity in hell in those horrible ways. But at the same time, I was thinking, but if someone was to think about that story in that way, then I guess that it would be somewhat of a faulty way of approaching it, in the sense that that's not about God punishing those people. That's about how people would like for people that did those sorts of things to be punished. That kind of difference, and that's why, even as an atheist and as a secular person, I read it, and it still makes sense to me that a human being would imagine people that did those sorts of things to other people being punished and wanting them to be punished that way, because that's just that's just what people want when someone does something that they think is wrong, right?
Absolutely. I mean, even you don't have to believe in either, a literal or even a quasi-literal interpretation of the Bible to understand that these are seminal stories and are incredibly revealing of humanity and humanity's struggle and our march through history. And the same as with mythology, Greek mythology. I mean, at the time it was written, these people believed in these gods. It wasn't a fiction for them. I mean, it was a fiction, but it was a fictionalized story of these gods, but it was very real to them, and which is easy to lose track of now because we see them as entertainment, and as sort of part of the fantasy genre. But we are, I think, fundamentally in one way or another, we are religious people, whether we believe in an actual deity or not. I think that that it manifests itself perhaps in different ways. Some people become very religious about their atheism. Some people become religious about politics, and which can also be problematic, since politics fundamentally is supposed to be about compromise. But if you feel religiously about something, you're incapable of compromise because you believe. Fundamentally, it is a belief. It's not about governance.
And I mean, it doesn't even make sense to me. Yeah, it doesn't even make sense to me to think about religious people as some atheists think as stupid or limited or something like that. Because I mean, just think about it. There are a ton of things in your life that you need that are non-factual. It's just you deciding to believing in them or not. Like, for example, your morality, your politics, the kind of meaning you give to your life. And I mean, all of those, even things about the way you establish relationships with other people. I mean, for all that matters, you could decide to simply not believe that emotions are real, that feelings are real, and you could just brush all the other people aside and say, I don't care about this, I don't want this in my life because these are not factual things and I only care about what science says or something like that. But I mean, there's not a single functional human being out there, at least that I know about, that doesn't need those sorts of things in their lives. And I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's just things that either you decide to believe in them or you don't, and that's it. There's no way to prove that there's one moral system that is objectively better than the other. There's probably no way to prove that there's a God out there.
Probably not.
Empirically speaking, there's probably no way to prove factually that your politics is better than the politics of another person. I mean, a ton of things that you have in your life and that are really at the basis of you pushing forward and continue living, because otherwise, what would you be doing just here collecting facts? But even to collect the facts, you need some sort of motivation. Right? So.
No, I mean, neither love nor art are factual.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, I mean, there are certain factual elements, I guess, in art. You can say that person's brushstroke and that painting is amazing, but you can have a flawless technique that falls utterly flat, and does not in any way move an individual. It might inspire a certain degree of awe because of the flawless technique, for instance. But how do you qualify when something moves you? How do you factualize that? How do you factualize a gut feeling? Which I think is an incredibly important element of science, right? I think every scientist starts out with a gut feeling about something. Mm-hmm. And that gut feeling is either proven right or wrong. But nevertheless, it's there. And then you see where the data takes you, which actually I kind of view art and literature in the same way. As a writer, to some extent, you start off with a gut feeling, and then you see where that gut feeling takes you, and through trial and error, you come up with a story, and you bring that story to a conclusion, that obviously you have a lot more control over than maybe a scientist does, because you're not looking for an absolute truth necessarily when you're writing a story. You're looking for some variation of the truth. You're looking for a way of satisfying emotions as well, which I think is, can be a little precarious sometimes, but yes, I so agree. I think that we've gotten to a place, and I think that it has definitely infected art and literature, where we are maybe not looking at it in the spirit in which it was meant to be looked at. That we take art literally instead of using it as a plaything, as an intellectual plaything, something where we can, play with ideas and safely look at things from an alternative point of view. I mean, I'm always amazed when people talk about Nabokov's Lolita, that there is a very large group of people out there who are not willing to even consider it, and are angry that it is considered a masterpiece because of its subject matter.
Because it in some
because
way
it's about a pedophile.
Invokes pedophilia. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think most of the people who are so angry about the book probably haven't read it. That's at least what I suspect. Maybe that's not true, but I do suspect it. But what I found so incredibly compelling about Lolita was the fact that he was in Humbert Humbert. He was really showing us what someone like this looks like, mm-hmm. and warts and all. I don't think that he was particularly kind to that character, but he was able to show it to a certain extent from his point of view, and I think that's what, again, was probably so dangerous, what feels so dangerous to people. You cannot possibly, because by showing that, I think the argument goes that simply by showing that, you are somehow giving it a gold star, that you're giving it a stamp of approval. And it's like, well, no, you're not. No, you're not. Otherwise, what could we show? We could show nothing.
I guess that goes back to, I'm not sure if we talked about this during the interview or before the interview, because we've been talking for a long time here. But at a certain point, we were talking about how, people deal badly with the fact that certain people have certain thoughts.
Yeah.
That's basically what we're talking about
right.
here, that there are pedophiles out there and how they feel and think about children in that case. And I mean...
It's very threatening.
But it is. At the end of the day, does it really matter if there are people out there that think those kinds of thoughts? Isn't it the case that what really matters is if they do something
yes.
about them or not? Because, are we really going to punish people or to oppress people socially in some way just because they might be having some sort of thought, even though they don't put anything into practice. Of course, in the book, that's not.
He does put it in practice.
He does put it. Yeah, but anyway, we are talking about a book. We are not talking about an actual,
reality, exactly.
an actual real pedophile, right? So the book itself is just an exercise we can even call it a thought experiment, let's say.
Absolutely. It is a thought experiment. And thought experiments, I think, are crucial to, for one thing, a functioning society. Mm-hmm. I think that when you have dysfunction in a society, where you can see it bubbling up is where these thought experiments are being squelched. Mm-hmm. That can happen en masse if you're living in a truly tyrannical society, an autocratic society perhaps, or a theocratic society. And it also happens in functioning democracies, where you may have certain factions that rise and try to silence other factions and don't want to hear a certain point of view, but it tends to be more fluid, at least in functioning democracies, and I think healthier in the end, because we're at least able to have those conversations on some level, even if there is a certain level of danger involved to those conversations. But I think that those thought experiments, that is the whole point of art. That is the whole point of literature. It's the whole point of fantasy. And again, it's why I became interested in writing about lovers, because, one of the things that I find interesting is sexual fantasy and the relationship that it has to the way we really behave, mm-hmm. right? It's, I was talking to a teenage boy, it was a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the way, porn has been mainstreamed. Mm-hmm. And he was expressing some sort of confusion and kind of mild disgust about it, because it was probably about a 13-year-old kid. And I said, well, the way you've got to look at it is porn is a little bit like that spy story where the spy breaks through the glass and jumps out of an 8-story window, falls, rolls, stands up, brushes the broken glass off of his Armani suit and keeps walking. I was like, that's the relationship to reality that pornography has. Most people don't conduct their lives that way. But clearly it is, we have since the dawn of time been in some manner using it as a thought experiment for our own sexuality, because everyone at one point or another has had some sort of, say, disturbing sexual fantasy, has had a fantasy that they in reality would not want playing out in their lives, mm-hmm. right? Either they would not want to be treated that way, or they wouldn't want to behave that way themselves. Some people take it even further and do role play, right, in their own lives. But again, that's not real, because they have all sorts of strictures that they've developed, right, where they might have a certain phrase that they say that ends the whatever scenario that they're acting out. I think that these are incredibly important, these thought experiments, as you call them. I love that phrase. I'm going to use it from now on, but I will always attribute it to you. But how absolutely vital are these thought experiments? They are vital. We've got to be able to think about them. First of all, for the ones that are truly dangerous, for instance, like pedophilia, you've got to be able to think about them to be able to discount them. Mm-hmm. You've got to go beyond the fantasy of, if you are one of those people who is inclined towards, really young people and are attracted to really young people. Well, let's see what that looks like. Mm-hmm. Let's see what that is besides the initial, whatever it is that brings you to this person who you should certainly not be getting involved with. how does that look at the end? Where does that bring you? Usually to no place good. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Without that thought experiment, how do you even get there? How do you even get to that bad place? How do you even, if you can't think about it, if you can't go there, if you are not allowed to think that there is a God or there is no God, how do you even understand what the world looks like? Mm-hmm. With that point of view, for instance, how do you understand how it is that you're going to live your life if you don't take yourself through dangerous scenarios in your own mind? I don't even know what that's like. I mean, certainly, I told you how I had a child born very ill. Mm-hmm. I had to think when she was sick, I believed that she was going to survive, and she did. I believed it in my heart, in my gut. I really believed that she was going to survive. But I absolutely took myself to the place where she didn't and what that was going to look like. And I was really afraid to go there. Because it was very painful to go there. And I tried to, but just the very process of taking myself through that and looking at what life would look like on the other side actually made it bearable. Mm-hmm. And helped me see that I would survive, that there was another side to that, and that it may not be what you want, it may not be, obviously the outcome that you hope for, but it's really important to go through and allow yourself to go there. Those things come up in our lives. They're not necessarily always dangerous and criminal, the way they are in Lolita, for instance. But, these things do come up in our lives where we're faced with either a difficult situation and we are given a choice as to how to approach that situation. And, how do you know which route to take if you're not willing to imagine both routes?
Right. Yeah. Have you ever read books by a Portuguese guy called Fernando Pessoa?
No, but I'm writing that down. No, in front of me. Oh, yes, I do.
No, I just asked you because there are a lot of foreign people that know Pessoa.
I feel like I've heard the name, but I'm terribly forgetful.
Yeah, and I just brought him up because he had a very interesting way of thinking about social conventions, and I'm bringing this up because we're talking about fiction and fantasy, and things like that. And he thought about social conventions as fictions. Yeah, and that's very interesting because if you go to the bottom of it, that's in fact what they are, right? For example, our nations are simply things that we come up with. Right. You can't find anywhere in the planet a frontier that hasn't been artificially created by human beings. That doesn't exist. The reason why we can use money and it works is because we attribute value to money, and we trust that piece of paper or that coin. If we bring them to another person, then we will be able to trade it, let's say, for other goods. Our moral systems, our systems of law, our political systems, all of those things, if we really think about it, I've been talking on the show with people that do work on cultural evolution, but if you look back, things evolve, and it is kind of an overstretched thought experiment that people have been doing through a vast extenses of time. I mean, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of years in some cases, maybe. So, I mean, I guess that what I'm trying to arrive at with this is that maybe people shouldn't be that quick in terms of separating what they call reality from fiction, because many of the things that they take as real are, in some sense, even though they have maybe more impact or more direct impact in their lives, are as derived from fiction as fiction itself, I guess.
Well, yeah, it is. It's kind of like the artist Escher. You know, do you know Escher? The hand, drawing the hand. He has this, and all of those. But that, you know, as a kid, I just loved his work. I had it all over my room, you know, and which I guess was a clue as to what I was going to end up doing for a living. But that's exactly it. I mean, fiction is a reflection of reality, which is a reflection of fiction, which is a reflection. You know, this goes on, and it's incredibly circular, and that is part of what helps us figure things out. It's part of what has helped us arrive to these very systems that you're talking about. A system of money, for instance, of having a piece of paper, and I hand you this piece of paper, and it actually means something. But if I hand you a different piece of paper, it means nothing.
Right.
You know, if the fact that we sign a piece of paper or have another person officiate a ceremony which binds us legally and emotionally to another person and makes that stranger a member of our family who is more immediate than our own mother. Suddenly, legally, right? Because we don't have to legally separate from our parents after we're 18, right? We can just decide that we want to be around them or not. You know, I mean, and these are things we've all arrived at over a really long stretch of time through these thought experiments, and they're incredibly crucial to deciding, you know, what is important to us, you know, what strictures we need to keep in place and which ones we need to be more flexible on. And, you know, without that constant play, whenever we, I think, find ourselves in a point in time where that play feels perhaps very threatening, and maybe that's always. I mean, maybe we are always struggling with this. Maybe it just feels incredibly immediate right now because, you know, we now have social media, so we are actively having a fight every single day, you know, and all of this might have just been bubbling under the surface before, and we just didn't see it right in front of us every day. But you know, that way of imagining and placing ourselves in sometimes these very extraordinary circumstances of taking, you know, of taking our schleppy selves, that person who just shows up at the subway every day like we do with his book or her book and sits down and waits for their call to be stopped, you know, what is that person's journey? And that person has multiple journeys every day. And we actually do have those possibilities in reality in our lives, these hidden possibilities and these hidden choices that we often, I think, don't even realize because they seem like non-choices. Well, of course I wasn't going to talk to that girl. I had a meeting. I couldn't talk to her. I didn't have time. Or, of course I wouldn't talk to that girl. I'm like 5'3" and she was like 5'11", and you know, or whatever it was, you know, and taking ourselves through that call to adventure, in that sort of thought experiment, in that sort of fictionalized world, I think helps better prepare us for when we do actually find ourselves in a situation where we maybe unwillingly are forced into a call to action, because that also happens. It happens in small ways. It happens in small ways, say at work, if we need to stand by an idea that we had, that maybe is unpopular, but we feel very strongly about the company taking that direction, say, or we may find ourselves in that situation in our own family life and dealing with any number of things, from illness to infidelity to our own conflict with our choices in life, as we find ourselves maybe not where we wanted to be, or we find ourselves exactly where we wanted to be, and it wasn't that great. It's not as great as we thought, and now we want to change it, or whatever it is. How do we even have, it's things like mythology and morality plays even, and religious structures and social structures and clubs, and all of these things work together to help us navigate these very complicated landscapes that we find ourselves in. Even the most sort of simple and maybe shy and passive of us, who are just trying to get through the day and not make any waves, and look, I just want to get there, and then I want my pension, or whatever it is, and I'm not going to make problems with my spouse. They don't like this, so I'm not even going to mention it. Even the people who are the most passive of us and the most conflict averse, I think, desperately need those avenues. And and I think that when we are denied them, or we deny them to ourselves, we deny ourselves those avenues, we act out. Mm-hmm. I see that. I feel like I see that on social media all the time, and I wonder if the people who are so angry, and are always looking for people to have a beef with and to be upset about, I wonder if that anger has not replaced their fantasy life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me just tell you that the first time you talked about the call for adventure, I went through, I was in pure agony since then, because I couldn't remember the name of the author, but it's Joseph Campbell.
Yes, Joseph Campbell, yeah.
But I didn't say anything, but I was here internally in pure agony, because I couldn't.
I can't remember that author's name.
Yeah, but anyway. Oh, by the way, I'm also starting to get a bit worried about your time, because we're already talking for 3 hours here. So
I'm a sucker for a good conversation. I once you get me talking, I never shut up. I think a lot of it is also, writers are very solitary people. They don't. I work from home, and, so it's dangerous getting me in a conversation, because I don't know when to stop.
Okay, so look, just before we go, could you tell us a little bit more about the book you're working on at the moment? I don't know if you already have a title to it or not.
Oh yeah, I have a series that I call the series the Breath series, because the first big book in the series is called Breath, and I'm having actually a teaser novel is coming out in about 4 weeks called Savage Island, and the premise of the series, it is about these two lovers who were originally born to a very ancient pre-Sumerian civilization, but in their first lives became these recurrent souls, where they're born over and over again. So I guess in a sense, it's a story of reincarnation. They're not in the sense that everybody is reincarnated. It's really just sort of these people, these souls who are as rare as angels and demons, and they must find each other in each of their lives, but they also have a quest, this mystery, this quest that they must solve throughout their lives and throughout history, and they enlist the help of, people in each life who are not recurrent souls in trying to solve this mystery that is a threat to all of humanity. So that is the scope of the series. And the first one, the sort of teaser novel, Savage Island, which takes place in the South Pacific in 1944, is coming out. And then the first big book will be out some months later, and that is the story of their first lives in this ancient civilization and how they actually became ninti, which is what I call these recurrent souls. They're ninti. So it's quite a departure from what I usually write, because I write these very gritty Cold War historical thrillers with a pretty serious noir bent. So this is a departure, even though I think it's still very much in that sort of realm of, like I said, I find war riveting. Mm-hmm. And I find I am really somebody who loves conflict in a story. And so that is a part of it. I mean, in this ancient civilization that I'm writing about, which was ultimately destroyed, which is why none of us know about it. There's also some of the more human, the characters, well, they're all human, but who are not recurrent souls, are archaeologists who are uncovering this ancient civilization in the series and learning about it. And this ancient civilization essentially was destroyed in part by a plague and also in part by poor governance, and in a complete breakdown of the civil structure. And, I read a lot about the rape of Nanking, for instance, mm-hmm. And these really massive breaks from civility and how they played out. And I applied that to an entire civilization, mm-hmm. In this first civilization that was destroyed and produced these two souls, these two lovers. So it's been a really interesting journey, because I've gotten to research so many interesting things. Like the rape of Nanking, and I've researched biological warfare and evolutionary psychology, and having to create characters. And this is really hard, and I have no idea if I've done it successfully. You don't know until people start reading it. But having to create characters that travel through time and become different people, and yet have core character elements that you can relate to and that are consistent, because you want to be, as a reader, you want to be reacting to the same people, and yet they're not the same. Sometimes they are these pre-Sumerian people, other times they're British and working in the golden age of archaeology around 1900 in Cairo, and other times they are the children of Spanish conquistadors. Mm-hmm. And this is a huge journey, but it's fun. It's really fun. And I'm still going to be writing the Cold War thrillers. But anyway, that's that.
Okay, and do you know when the first book of the series will be out?
Yeah, it's coming out in a month. The teaser novel is coming out in a month. And then the big book in the series, the teaser novel is, standard novel length. And then the first book in the series is more like 500-page book. It's like a big book. And that will be coming out next year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I will be expecting that, I guess,
Right.
because now you teased me. So, and it seems a very interesting story. So, oh, by the way, don't end the call. Let me just end the interview because I have one very interesting thing to tell you
Okay.
before we go.
Right.
Anyway, Victoria, thank you a lot for taking
Thank
the
you.
time to come
This has
on
been
the show, and it was, I mean, I really loved the conversation. So.
Me too. This has been so fun. Anytime.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you also have the alternatives of Subscribestar and PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Gondriano, Jana Eninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Doctors Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingard, and also my 3 producers, Isar Webb, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.